The lake always looked calm in the mornings, the kind of calm that seemed almost staged, like a photograph hanging on someone's wall. Mist clung low over the water, and the soft ripples looked like they could keep secrets. The cabins that lined the shore weren't glamorous. Some were old, patched together with paint and stubborn repairs, but they carried the weight of family stories, summer escapes, and promises of peace. People came here to breathe differently, slower, as if the lake could wash away the noise of their other lives. On the surface, it felt untouched, safe. But when something feels too still, too perfect, there's usually tension hiding under it. The community around the lake was tight, but not in the way of warm embraces and open doors. It was a controlled kind of closeness, with neighbors who noticed every car, every guest, every sound that didn't fit the script. Most people learned to blend in, to smile at the right moments, to mow their lawns on time, to keep their business tucked away. But even in places that pretend to be peaceful, control has its cracks, and once someone tries to test the edges, those cracks widen fast. The main cabin sat near the end of a dirt road that twisted along the water. It wasn't new. The wood carried years of rain and winters. The porch sagged a little at the edge, but there was something honest about it. It didn't pretend to be anything more than what it was, a lake house for someone who wanted quiet. The man moving in was one of those people who didn't seem interested in being noticed. He carried his boxes without asking for help, parked his truck without a word, and kept his head down. To him, this wasn't about belonging to the community. It was about finding a place to rest, away from the constant push of the world. But not everyone saw it that way. Just a few cabins down, there was a woman whose eyes were always open wide, death than they needed to be. She had the kind of voice that carried, sharp, even when she was speaking softly. She was known for her rules, for her belief that the lake wasn't just a place to live, it was an order stage, a stage where she got to play director. People called her different names behind her back, but one stuck more than the rest. Karen. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the type who turned every small act into a battle of principles, every quiet choice into a personal offense. The families around her had learned to avoid trouble. They nodded politely when she spoke, followed the rules she wrote down for them, and swallowed their frustration. But deep down, most of them lived in quiet resentment. There was something dangerous about the way one person could bend an entire group with nothing more than pressure and persistence. It wasn't a crime. Not yet. But it carried the same weight as one. Unseen bruises, quiet fear, choices made not because they were right, but because they were demanded. The man moving into the cabin didn't know this yet. To him, the lake seemed like a place where silence could heal him. He had been carrying his own heavy story, one that didn't need another audience. The last thing he wanted was someone watching him, questioning why he came, or deciding whether he belonged. But with Karen, that was impossible. She had already decided what she thought of him before his truck tires had cooled. On the surface, life moved as it always did. Children rode bikes down gravel paths. The sound of boats hummed across the water. Porch lights flicked on when the sun dropped behind the trees. But beneath the rhythm, there was tension winding tighter. People whispered about property lines, about noise, about rules that seemed to change depending on who Karen approved of. The crime hadn't happened yet, not in the way people would talk about it later. But the roots were already there, in the power one person clung to, in the silence others lived under, in the way control can twist a peaceful place into something fragile. All it would take was a moment, one clash, for the calm surface of the lake to shatter. And when it did, it wouldn't just be about one man moving into a cabin. It would be about what happens when fear and pride collide, when control is challenged, and when someone who has always dictated the rules finally faces a force they can't silence. For now, though, the lake still looked calm. But if you paid attention, if you looked long enough, you could already see the storm coming. The first week at the lake passed quietly. The man moving into the cabin, his name was Daniel, kept his head low, unloading boxes and setting up furniture without making much noise. He didn't go out of his way to meet neighbors, but he wasn't rude either. If someone waved, he nodded. If a car passed, he lifted a hand from the wheel. He wanted space, and that much was obvious. But the thing about people like Karen was that they hated when someone didn't fall into their orbit. To her, Daniel's silence wasn't peace. It was defiance. The first real clash came when Daniel parked his truck too close to the road one evening while unloading. The dirt road was wide enough for 2 vehicles, but Karen made sure to pull her SUV to a stop right beside him. She rolled down her window and, with that sharp voice of hers, told him, "We don't park on the roadside here. It's dangerous. It blocks emergency access." Her eyes flicked over his truck, like it carried a disease. Daniel looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He didn't argue. He simply moved the truck into his drive and went back inside. For most people, that would have been the end. But with Karen, every nod felt like fuel. She read compliance as submission, and once she thought she had the upper hand, she wanted more. Neighbors started noticing how often Karen checked in near Daniel's cabin. She'd walk her dog in tight circles near his porch, slowing down to glance at his windows. She told others she was just keeping an eye on things. But it was more than that. She needed to know what he was doing, why he was there, and whether he fit her picture of who belonged. Daniel ignored her at first. He kept to his routine. Mornings by the lake, afternoons repairing loose boards on his deck, evenings inside with the soft glow of a lamp. But even silence can provoke someone who feeds on control. The second moment came during a Saturday gathering down by the water. Families had dragged lawn chairs and coolers to the shore. Kids splashed near the dock, and laughter carried across the lake. Daniel had kept to himself that week, but he showed up late in the afternoon, carrying a folding chair and a small cooler. He wasn't loud, didn't try to insert himself into anyone's circle. He just sat at the edge of the crowd, cracked open a beer, and watched the water. It should have been harmless, but Karen, standing among her usual circle, didn't like it. She leaned into the group and whispered, too loudly for it to really be private. "Strange how he never says much. People like that usually have something to hide." Heads turned. Eyes landed on Daniel. Some looked away quickly, embarrassed. Others lingered, curious. Daniel felt it, the burn of being judged without a word. He stayed for an hour, then packed up and left without saying goodbye. That night, whispers spread through the cabins. Who was this man, really? Why had he come here? Why didn't he bring family? Why was he alone? Karen fed the curiosity with half-truths and speculation. She painted him as a mystery, and in a community that thrived on gossip, a mystery could be dangerous. External pressures began to squeeze from the outside too. Daniel had come to the lake for peace, but peace costs money. The cabin wasn't new, and repairs piled up quickly. The roof leaked in 2 spots. The plumbing rattled like bones in the night. His savings, already thin, started slipping away. He picked up part-time work in town, fixing engines at a small shop. He told no one about the weight of those bills, but it showed in the lines under his eyes. And it didn't help that the townspeople, after hearing whispers from lake residents, treated him like he carried trouble with him. They didn't know his story, only Karen's version. Karen herself had secrets, though she wore them like armor. Her husband, a man who kept mostly silent and avoided conflict, had been pulling away from her for years. He no longer argued when she barked rules at neighbors. He simply retreated deeper into his garage, into long drives, into anywhere she wasn't. Her control over the lake community wasn't just about rules. It was about filling a hole inside her that she refused to admit was there. Power over others was the only thing that made her feel steady. When Daniel didn't bend to her, when he didn't seek her approval, it cracked her control. That crack terrified her more than she'd ever admit. One late evening, another confrontation spilled into the open. Daniel had a friend visit, just one, a quiet man from town who helped him with some heavy lifting. They worked on the cabin until dusk, music playing low from a speaker. It wasn't loud, but it was enough for Karen to march down the road, her dog tugging at the leash. She stopped at the edge of Daniel's drive and shouted over the music. "We don't allow that kind of noise here after dark. There are rules." Her words were sharp, but her eyes flicked toward the stranger, scanning him up and down. Daniel stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "It's just a little music. We'll wrap it up soon." But calm didn't satisfy her. She raised her phone like a weapon. "If this happens again, I'll call the HOA or the cops." The visitor shook his head, muttering something under his breath. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Later, after Karen stormed off, his friend told him, "She's going to make you her project." From that night on, Daniel felt the walls close in. Every time he left the cabin, eyes followed. If he parked his truck too close to the water, someone mentioned it. If his grass grew a little too long, someone hinted at standards. He wasn't living alone anymore. He was living under a microscope, every move measured against unwritten rules, and at the center of it all stood Karen, feeding on every slip. The other neighbors weren't blind. Some pitied Daniel, others stayed quiet to avoid becoming targets themselves. But there were cracks in their silence too. A retired couple whispered about how Karen once forced them to repaint their shutters because she didn't like the color. Another neighbor, younger, admitted she'd been fined for leaving a kayak on the beach overnight. Everyone had a story, but no one had ever pushed back. Karen's reign stood unbroken. Daniel wasn't the kind of man to seek out fights, but he was also not built to live under someone else's thumb. The more Karen pressed, the more something old and tired inside him stirred. He had come to the lake to escape conflict, to start fresh. But instead of peace, he found himself back in the same cycle he thought he'd left behind. People judging, controlling, pushing him into corners. The difference was that this time, he had nowhere else to go. The turning point came during a town hall-style meeting for lake residents. The HOA gathered at the community center, a small wooden building that smelled of coffee and damp wood. The chairs scraped against the floor as neighbors settled in. Daniel hadn't planned to attend, but Karen had slipped a flyer into his mailbox with the words "mandatory attendance" scrawled at the bottom. So he came, sitting in the back, arms crossed. Karen took the floor quickly, standing tall, her papers stacked neatly. She talked about standards, safety, and community image. Then, almost casually, she slid in a new proposal, limiting boat access to long-standing residents only. The words were sharp, pointed straight at Daniel. A murmur went through the room. People shifted, uneasy. Daniel sat still, heat rising in his chest. Karen's eyes found him in the back, and for the first time, he stared back without flinching. The silence between them stretched. Everyone in the room felt it, the clash coming, the storm breaking. From that day, the air around the lake changed. Conversation stopped when Daniel walked by. Karen's smile grew sharper, her tone more clipped. Daniel, once quiet, started speaking back, not loudly but firmly. He stopped moving his truck when she told him to. He left a chair out on his porch just to spite her whispered rules, and every small act of defiance fed the fire. No one could say exactly when the breaking point would come, but they all felt it. The lake that once seemed calm now carried tension in every ripple. The lines were drawn, even if no one admitted it out loud. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules anymore. She was fighting to hold on to the control that defined her. And Daniel wasn't just defending his choices. He was fighting for the right to exist without being crushed. The unease grew thick, wrapping itself around the community. All it needed was one spark, and when it came, no one would be able to claim they hadn't seen it coming. It started on a heavy August evening when the air itself felt like it was holding its breath. The lake was too still. the kind of stillness that presses against your skin, sticky and electric, as if waiting for something to snap. The cicadas screamed from the trees, their voices sharp and endless, and the light was fading into a deep orange glow that stretched long shadows across the dirt road. Daniel had been outside, fixing the screen on his porch door, when Karen showed up again. Her dog strained on its leash, barking, but her voice was louder, sharper, slicing through the quiet like a blade. "Rules exist for a reason," she snapped, holding her phone like a badge of authority. "You can't just do whatever you want here. This isn't your lake." Daniel wiped sweat from his forehead, his jaw tightening. He didn't answer right away. He'd learned that silence drove her mad, but tonight he was tired, too tired of the constant poking, the endless accusations. He finally muttered, "It's not your lake either." It was barely above a whisper, but it was enough. Karen's face twisted, her eyes wide with disbelief that someone dared to push back. The argument escalated fast. Voices carried across the water, drawing curtains back in nearby cabins. Her words spilled out, each sharper than the last, accusing him of trespassing, of disrespecting, of endangering her community. Daniel's chest burned, every nerve sparking, but underneath the anger was something heavier, exhaustion. He had come here for peace, and instead he was cornered again, judged again, controlled again. Something inside him cracked. When Karen raised her phone, threatening to call the cops, Daniel stepped closer. His voice shook, not from fear, but from the weight of years of being pushed down. "You don't get to control me," he said. For a moment the world seemed to still, the cicadas, the water, even the air. Karen flinched but didn't back away. Instead, she lifted her chin, her thumb hovering over the screen. "Then the police will." The next few seconds happened like a blur, fast but stretched, each moment thick with heat and fury. Daniel reached for the phone, not to hurt her, not at first, but to stop her. She jerked back, stumbling on the uneven ground. The dog barked wildly, yanking at the leash, tangling around her legs. She shouted his name like it was an accusation, the sound echoing off the water. In the struggle, the phone flew from her hand, landing in the dirt with a crack. Karen lunged for it, but Daniel's hand closed around her arm, pulling her back. The fight wasn't planned. It wasn't clean. It was raw, messy, desperate. Her voice rose higher, shrill, almost panicked now. "You don't belong here. You never belonged here." The words pierced deeper than she knew. Daniel's chest heaved, his grip tightening without thought, his vision blurring with heat and rage. He shoved her back, too hard, too fast. She stumbled, her foot catching on a stone, and for a heartbeat she teetered, arms flailing. Then she fell backward down the slight slope, her head striking the edge of a rock that jutted from the ground. The sound was sickening, final, a crack that didn't belong in the rhythm of the night. The dog barked frantically, circling her, leash tangled around her arm. Daniel froze, the weight of silence crashing down after the chaos. His chest pounded, his breath shallow. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. But there she was, her body twisted against the slope, eyes open but empty, her voice gone. For a long moment Daniel just stood there, staring, the world narrowing to the sound of his own heartbeat. His hands shook violently, his throat dry. He stepped forward, kneeling, whispering her name like maybe she'd answer, like maybe this wasn't real. But the blood that seeped slowly into the dirt told the truth. Karen was gone. Panic hit him in waves, hot and suffocating. He staggered back, gripping his head, every thought colliding into the next. He hadn't planned this. He didn't want this. He only wanted her to stop, just for one night, just for one breath of quiet. But now, there was no turning back. Neighbors had heard. Curtains were still open. Lights flicked on in cabins. Any second now, someone would walk down that road, and he would be standing here, hands stained, eyes wild. He thought about running. The truck sat in the drive, keys inside. He could leave, vanish into the dark, let the lake swallow the story. But another voice in his head, quieter, steadier, told him he'd never escape this. Not the guilt, not the memory of her falling, not the sound of her skull meeting stone. It would follow him, no matter how far he drove. The dog whined, pawing at Karen's still body. The sound ripped through him. He bent down again, trembling, reaching toward her, as if one touch could undo what he'd done. His fingers hovered over her skin, then curled into fists. He couldn't face it. From the cabins, voices rose, questioning, cautious. "What's going on out there?" someone called. Another shouted, "Karen!" Footsteps crunched against gravel. Daniel's body went cold. He grabbed the phone from the dirt, its screen shattered, and shoved it into his pocket without thinking. Then he backed away, step by step, until he was standing on his porch, staring at the scene as if it belonged to someone else. Neighbors appeared at the edge of the road, their flashlights cutting through the dusk. Gasps broke the night when they saw her, motionless, blood pooling beneath her head. Someone screamed. Someone else dropped to their knees, shouting for help. The sound of a phone dialing 911 pierced the air. Daniel stood frozen, his body locked in place. He wanted to confess, to scream that it was an accident, that he hadn't meant for any of this. But the words tangled in his throat, heavy and impossible. All he could feel was the weight of eyes turning toward him, suspicion sparking, whispers starting. He could already hear the story being written without him. The stranger at the lake, the quiet man who snapped, the outsider who never belonged. As sirens began to wail in the distance, echoing across the still water, Daniel's chest tightened. This was the breaking point, the moment everything shifted. Karen's reign of control had ended in blood, but so had his chance at peace. What remained was chaos, neighbors crying out, lights flashing red and blue against the water, and the haunting silence of a woman who would never speak again. And in that silence, Daniel knew nothing would ever be the same. The sirens came fast, cutting through the thick night air, bouncing off the lake until it felt like the sound was coming from everywhere at once. By the time the first patrol car turned down the gravel road, neighbors were already huddled in groups, their voices hushed but charged with fear. Some clutched their children close, others stood with arms crossed, eyes locked on Daniel's cabin. The quiet peace of the lake had been ripped apart, and nobody could pretend otherwise. The deputies moved quickly, their flashlights sweeping over Karen's body. A medic checked for signs of life, but everyone watching already knew the truth. The announcement came softly, almost routine, but it landed like thunder. She was gone. Karen, the woman who had ruled every corner of their lives, who had enforced her own order with unshakable certainty, lay still at the base of the slope. For some, the sight was shocking, unreal. For others, there was a darker, unspoken thought they buried deep. Relief. Daniel stood off to the side, his shirt damp with sweat, his hands trembling no matter how tightly he clenched them. An officer approached, asked him what had happened. His mouth opened, but the words wouldn't form. He stammered, muttered something about her slipping, about trying to grab her. His voice shook, thin and broken. The officer didn't press, not then. They cuffed him anyway. The clink of metal echoed across the road, and that sound, Daniel's wrists bound, seared itself into the memory of everyone watching. The community broke into whispers before the police cars had even pulled away. Some neighbors said it had been brewing for weeks, that anyone could have seen it coming. Others swore they had always known there was something off about Daniel. A few stayed silent, guilt heavy in their chests, because they knew the truth, that Karen had made life unbearable for him, just as she had for them, and they had done nothing to stop it. Now with her gone, all of that silence felt like complicity. In the days that followed, grief and shock clashed with gossip. Karen's husband, a man who had always seemed invisible beside her, broke down when the news reporters arrived. Cameras caught him crying at the edge of the lake, his voice cracking as he described her as the heart of the community. To the outside world, she was painted as a devoted woman, a protector of her neighborhood. The stories of her control, her manipulation, her constant battles didn't make it past the headlines. She was remembered as a victim, a woman killed near her home by the stranger who had moved in next door. Daniel's story never had a chance to breathe. The media twisted him into an easy villain, the recluse with a temper, the outsider who couldn't fit in. The photos they chose were harsh. His mugshot, eyes hollow and tired, plastered across screens. No one wanted to hear about the months of pressure, the endless battles, the exhaustion that had worn him down. The world outside the lakefront only cared about the surface, a quiet man who snapped and killed a woman who just wanted rules followed. Inside the community, the aftermath dug deeper. Some residents felt a strange, guilty freedom without Karen's constant watch. They no longer feared notes in their mailbox or sudden confrontations on the road. But that relief was buried under the weight of tragedy. They couldn't speak it aloud. To admit relief was to admit resentment, and resentment toward the dead was too heavy to bear. So they mourned her in public, standing at her memorial service with solemn faces, laying flowers by the dock. In private, though, their emotions twisted into something far more complicated. Daniel, locked in a county cell, replayed the night again and again. Every detail cut into him, the sound of her head striking stone, the dog's desperate bark, the way her words had stabbed at old wounds. He didn't try to justify it, not really. But he couldn't escape the thought that if he'd just stayed inside, if he'd walked away one more time, she would still be alive. His lawyer told him to keep quiet, to stick to the claim that it was an accident. But Daniel's silence wasn't a strategy. It was guilt. The kind that gnawed at him in the sleepless hours. The kind that made breathing feel like punishment. Karen's husband retreated after the cameras left, locking himself away. Without her, his world felt hollow. Though some whispered he looked more at peace without her shadow hovering over him. Still, grief is grief, even tangled with resentment. He was left to carry both, the sorrow of losing her and the unspoken relief of being free. That contradiction aged him fast. He stopped walking on his property, stopped fishing at the dock. It was as if the lake itself had turned against him, reminding him of everything he'd lost, and everything he never dared admit while she lived. The HOA fell apart within weeks. Without Karen, no one wanted to take up her mantle. Rules went unenforced, meetings were cancelled, and for the first time in years, neighbors breathed without the weight of her oversight. But freedom didn't erase the stain of what had happened. Outsiders whispered about the lake community as if it were cursed. Property values dipped. New families hesitated to buy. The once proud image of order and control dissolved into whispers of tragedy, of danger, of a neighborhood tainted by violence. Children who had played on the shore now avoided the slope where Karen had fallen. Parents warned them away, but the kids already knew the story, pieced together from overheard purrs. They pointed at Daniel's cabin like it was haunted, daring each other to run up the porch steps and back. Even in the absence, the crime lived on, shaping the way they saw the world, how fragile it was, how quickly it could tilt from control to chaos. As the legal case moved forward, Daniel's name became both feared and pitied. Some neighbors wrote quiet letters to the court, asking for leniency, describing Karen's years of control. Others stayed silent, afraid to tie themselves to either side. The trial loomed like a storm cloud, its outcome uncertain, but no verdict could undo what had already been set in motion. The lakefront, once proud of its calm and order, now lived under a shadow. People remembered the sound of sirens, the sight of Karen's body under flashlight beams, the image of Daniel in handcuffs. They carried those memories like stones in their pockets, unseen but heavy. And with each passing day, the community learned that crime doesn't just end with the act itself. It lingers, reshaping lives, twisting memories, turning neighbors into strangers bound together by silence and secrets. The water still looked calm most mornings, reflecting the sky like nothing had changed. But those who lived there knew better. Beneath the surface, the ripples of that night never stopped moving. The trial came 6 months later, in the heart of winter, when the lake was locked under ice and the cabins stood quiet, boarded up until spring. By then, the story had already traveled far beyond the water's edge. News stations replayed the same images over and over. Daniel's mugshot, Karen's smiling portrait pulled from a community newsletter, footage of the patrol cars weaving down the dirt road. The world had already decided who the villain was. But inside the courtroom, things were more complicated. Daniel sat with his head bowed, thinner than before, his hair grown out, his eyes sunken from sleepless nights. His lawyer painted the picture of a man pushed to the edge, not a killer, but a neighbor, crushed under constant harassment. Witnesses from the lake spoke carefully, balancing truth against fear of judgment. Some admitted what Karen had been like, her need for control, the rules that seemed designed to suffocate rather than protect. Others stuck to the safer script, describing her as dedicated, misunderstood, a woman who only wanted what was best. The prosecution leaned into that version, showing Karen as the victim of an angry outsider who never fit in. They replayed the facts in blunt, simple strokes. A confrontation, a struggle, a fatal push. They asked the jury to see it not as an accident, but as violence. In the end, the verdict landed somewhere between. Daniel was found guilty of manslaughter, not murder. The judge spoke of reckless actions and avoidable tragedy. He was sentenced to years behind bars, long enough to feel the weight of what he had done, but not life. For some, it was justice. For others, it was mercy. For Daniel, it was both a punishment and a release. At last, there was no running from it. He would pay, and maybe, someday, he would find a way to breathe again. Karen's name was carved into a stone at the small town cemetery. Her funes. Rail had been filled with flowers, soft music, and words about her dedication to her community. But among the crowd, there were unspoken truths. People remembered the weight of her rules, the way she had bent their lives to fit her vision. They mourned her death, but also carried a quiet awareness that power, when wielded without compassion, can leave scars as deep as violence. Her husband lived in silence after her passing. He never spoke out during the trial, never wrote letters, never made statements to the press. Neighbors noticed the change in him. A man who no longer looked over his shoulder, but also no longer looked anyone in the eye. He carried both grief and relief, two truths that could never sit comfortably together. In a way, he was as trapped as Daniel, bound not by bars, but by memory. The lakefront changed too. Without Karen, the HOA crumbled into fragments. No one stepped forward to take her place. The rules loosened, the notes stopped appearing in mailboxes, and for the first time in years, people felt free to live without scrutiny. But that freedom came with a stain. Outsiders whispered about the lake where the woman was killed. Property values dipped, new buyers hesitated, and the once pristine image of a quiet retreat was replaced by a darker reputation. The community had lost more than Karen. It had lost its illusion of control. The broader world moved on, but the story lingered as a quiet caution. It raised uncomfortable questions about power, control, and how far people can be pushed before they break. Was Daniel a monster, or a man caught in a storm of pressure and judgment? Was Karen a protector, or an oppressor whose grip finally snapped? The truth, as always, lived somewhere in the uneasy middle. This case touched something raw in people because it wasn't just about one death. It was about the fragile balance between order and freedom, about the way control can mask fear, and about the quiet violence of being judged every day until you feel you have no escape. It showed how power, even in small doses, a note in a mailbox, a rule on a piece of paper, can shape lives, twist communities, and, in the wrong hands, ignite something dangerous. Justice, if it can be called that, was uneven. A woman lost her life. A man lost his freedom. A community lost its peace. There was no neat ending, no clear victory. What remained was a lesson about the thin line between authority and abuse, between silence and complicity, between accidents and choices. And in the quiet reflection after the trial, people saw themselves in the story. They thought about the neighbors they avoided, the rules they resented, the times they stayed silent when someone else bore, the weight of control. The lake became a mirror, showing not just the crime itself, but the cracks in human nature, the need for power, the struggle for freedom, the cost of silence. In the end, the water still lay calm most mornings, reflecting the sky like it always had. But for those who knew the story, the calm was different. It wasn't peace anymore. It was a reminder of how fragile peace really is, how easily it can shatter when fear and pride collide. And though years would pass, the echo of that night, the argument, the fall, the silence after, would never leave them. It lived on in every ripple, in every shadow on the lake, in every unspoken truth that neighbors carried with them long after the world stopped watching.